Hello and welcome to Episode 1, The Second Industrial Revolution, by Catherine Davis, Leah Davis, and Berkeley Fink. Today we are going to be detailing the major events of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution witnessed the expansion of electricity, petroleum, steel, and steam-powered engines. It also highlighted mass production and division of labor.
The Second Industrial Revolution brought new and advanced industries like steel, electricity, and chemicals. It introduced new industrial powers like Germany to the world and strengthened others like Great Britain. This revolution also brought upon societal advancements like public education, labor movements, and women's suffrage as well. Advancements in industries. During the Second Industrial Revolution, the production of steel was perfected. This advancement led to the construction of taller, stronger buildings and better machinery for production of goods. Electricity also emerged during this revolution. The electrical current and eventually generators were integrated into industries, and by the 1870s, electric motors were being built and they were exceeding steam-powered ones. Chemical advancements during this time included chemical substitutes for dye to produce uniform color, and dynamite, which was used to get past rocks or boulders in mines or on railroad routes. Chemical advancements during this time allowed manufacturers to sell goods at a price people could afford. Germany had the natural resources required to start an industrial revolution. But the Napoleonic Wars and their limited access to Atlantic trade routes stunted their growth until the Second Industrial Revolution. Prussia was a great economic power at this time, and they used that power to establish a tariff system and the Zollverein to unify Germany. They put tax on imported manufactured goods and overseas colonial trade. This was seen as a great step towards industrial growth. Inside their borders, they removed tolls and the custom region system, which allowed free trade among provinces. 19th century imperialism. European empires wanted to establish colonies to secure sources of raw materials like cotton, iron, and rubber. These resources were used to fund their growing industrial economies. For example, when Great Britain founded new trading posts and colonies in China and Africa, they spread their influence and power to these places as well.
Advancements in transportation and communication affected trade, migration, and global interactions during the Second Industrial Revolution. The most major innovation of both industrial revolutions were railroads. Though they were initially around in the First Industrial Revolution, they also made a huge impact during the Second Revolution. Before this development, economies were localized and based on a barter system. Railroads opened up new markets for farmers, industrialists, and bankers, who could now grow crops in areas further away. It also brought a dramatic reduction in the time and money used to move heavy goods, and created new opportunities for wealth at a time when most Americans were still farmers. However, railroads changed the natural environment of the West, and caused conflict with the Native Americans who had lived there. Another innovation in transportation was the automobile, which was first invented in 1886. However, it only became affordable to the public after the introduction of Ford's assembly line. Automobiles enabled people to go anywhere at any time and was a convenient and affordable method of transportation. There was also the airplane, first built in 1903 by the Wright brothers, which broadened the scope and distance of transportation. There were also innovations in communication, with the most important being the telephone. The telephone made it possible to communicate with people all around the world, rather than travel for days or send a letter. Overall, these innovations and inventions were able to link distant and isolated communities. Unfortunately, despite these improvements in worldly communication, the day-to-day lives of the poor and working class were riddled with hazards from pollution, overcrowding, poor working conditions, and child labor. Factories used huge amounts of human labor but ignored worker rights, and immigrants and children made up half of the workers. The manufacturing sector expanded dramatically during the Second Revolution, creating a wealthy class of entrepreneurs and a comfortable middle class, in addition to a large working class. This explosion in labor and job opportunities attracted many rural families to urban areas in search of a better life, though they were often disappointed. In factories, assembly lines created divisions of tasks that workers did in less than a minute. They often didn't understand the significance of their tasks to the total operations, and these tasks reduced the freedom of workers to introduce variety. Poor working conditions led to increased death rates. Workers had to deal with long days with little breaks and hot workplaces caused by steam engines, which made them sluggish and inalert. Additionally, the factories were not well lit, machinery was not enclosed, and the poor air quality caused disease in workers. Children, who also worked lengthy hours, had limited access to education, and many didn't attend school at all. However, there are many who advocated against child labor and wanted them in school. One newspaper clipping from 1905, written by Mrs. Langdon C. Stewartson, shows her attempting to arouse awareness for the National Child Labor Committee, which tried to improve the conditions of child labor. The newspaper article claims, quote, Miss Stewartson had already been able to send on a number of contributions from the Jamva people who are interested in bettering the condition of the poor and enforcing the law which provide that their earlier years shall be spent in school and not in shops or factories, end quote. While it is good that even some people at the time were aware of the hardships that children faced, this newspaper ad implies that they didn't have a large following. However, the article indicated that the children were clearly in a bad situation and didn't have any access to education. The living conditions for workers were equally as terrible, and families were packed in like sardines. Most of the population lived in tenements, and workers made so little money that it barely covered rent, which led to them living very basic lives. There was no privacy and few extra luxuries. Tenements disregarded safety, with things like improper ventilation and one bathroom for a couple hundred people. Pollution created hazardous conditions, especially for children. This, in addition to the overcrowdedness, led to sickness spreading quickly due to so many people crammed into such a small space. Tenements became a breeding ground for smallpox, cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis, and families couldn't afford medicines. Additionally, heat in the summer caused people to become fatigued and faint, and the building lacked running water, making it difficult for people to bathe properly and wash clothes. Low incomes caused families to struggle to feed themselves. Many starved, and others worked additional jobs and received less sleep. Middle-class, skilled laborers and entrepreneurs lived further away from cities due to illness and pollution. However, there were some reforms that attempted to improve conditions. The Tenement House Act of 1867 made tenements have at least one bathroom for every 20 people and improved the overall living conditions.
Women's suffrage, public education, and labor movements were three reactions to the Industrial Revolution. First, women's suffrage was affected by the Second Industrial Revolution because as gender roles became more equal in society, women wanted equal representation rights. So, they started fighting for the right to vote and didn't let anyone stop them. In 1918, women over 30 and women over 21 who were married to landowners got the right to vote. Public education was affected by the Industrial Revolution because as kids were incorporated into the workforce, many of them started to get a public education. Eventually, every child who was working in a factory was required to get at least 2 hours of education a day. Therefore, the public education system started to get funding from the government. Labor movements became common during the Industrial Revolution because many workers came together and fought for better wages, treatment, and work hours. Many workers worked long hours, were harshly treated, and weren't paid enough to live a healthy life. Capitalism and socialism are both economic and political systems in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by two different groups. Capitalism is a political system in which all industries are controlled by private companies, not by the government. On the other hand, socialism is when the government collectively owns most industries in a state. They are similar because they both deal with specific industries in a state and who they are owned by. An example of a country that had capitalism was the Netherlands. The Dutch had a significant amount of money during the era of the 7 Years' War, and they used socialism for their economy. Another country that had socialism was Great Britain. Great Britain was a world superpower at the time and continued to be for several years afterwards. The power of socialism all depends on the power of the government, and if politics in a state aren't strong enough, capitalism might be the right path. For example, India's trade was controlled by British private companies such as the East India Company. Today, we highlighted the details and major events regarding the Industrial Revolution. Thank you for listening to Episode 1, The Second Industrial Revolution. Stay tuned for more podcasts.